1. If we can stand for the invocation of the pledge. Lord, please bless this meeting and the participants, both official and unofficial. Everybody arrive safely and that we will get home safely. Help us to make wise decisions that favor the citizens of Canby. In your name, amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. So at this time, I'll ask for any input from citizens on non-agenda items. Would anybody like to speak on items that are not on the agenda? Okay. Then we will have approval of the Planning Commission minutes from February 27th. Has everybody had a chance to review those?
Mr. Chair, I recommend approval of the minutes from the previous meeting.
Do you have a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Brian, is there any new business? Okay. This time we will consider a request for a site and design review and variance applications for a proposed 58-unit complex on 2.5 acres located at 1203 and 1295 Northeast Territorial Road, DR 17-02 backslash VAR 17-01. I will read the public hearing format. First, we'll have the staff report, and then there will be questions, if any, by the Planning Commission. Then I will open the hearing for public testimony. The applicant will have not more than 15 minutes. Proponents, that is persons in favor of the application, not more than 5 minutes per person. Opponents, those opposed to the application, not more than 5 minutes per person. Neutral, that's persons with no opinion, not more than 5 minutes per person. And then rebuttal by the applicant, not more than 10 minutes. Then we will close the public hearing and no further public testimony will be allowed. Then questions by the Planning Commission, discussion by the Planning Commission, and then a decision by the Planning Commission. All interested persons in attendance shall be heard on the matter. If you wish to testify on this matter, please be sure to complete a testimony card and hand it to the recording secretary, which in this case is Brian. When the chair calls for proponents, if you favor the application, or opponents, if you are opposed to the application, please come forward, take the seat, speak into the microphone so the viewing public may hear you, and state your name, address, and interest in the matter. You may be limited by time for your statement depending upon how many people wish to testify. Everyone present is encouraged to testify, even if it is only to concur with previous testimony. All questions must be directed through the chair. Any evidence to be considered must be submitted to the hearing body for public access. Testimony and evidence must be directed toward the applicable review criteria contained in the staff report. Bless you. The comprehensive plan or other land use regulations which the person believes to apply to the decision. Failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the decision maker and interested parties an opportunity to respond to the issue may preclude appeal to the City Council and the Land Use Board of Appeals based on that issue. Failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues relating to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the local government to respond to the issue may preclude an action for damages in circuit court. Before the conclusion of the initial evidentiary hearing, any participant may ask the hearing body for an opportunity to present additional relevant testimony or evidence that is within the scope of the hearing. The Planning Commission shall grant such request by continuing the public hearing or leaving the record open for additional written evidence or testimony. Any such continuance of extension shall be subject to the limitations of the 120-day rule unless the continuance or extension is requested or agreed to by the applicant. If additional documents or evidence are provided by any party, the Planning Commission may, if requested, allow a continuance or leave the record open to allow the parties a reasonable opportunity to respond. Any such continuance or extension of the record requested by an applicant shall result in a corresponding extension of the 120-day time period. Brian?
Okay, thank you. Oops, thank you. And you heard the knocking. This property is located on Northeast Territorial Road on the south side, just before you get to the logging road trail where it has a pedestrian crossing that goes across the Territorial Road. And up towards the street, you'll see an existing house and another house behind it. The house in the back there is going to be removed, and the house in the front is not part of the proposed project, and that will be staying. And then on to the west, in a group of trees, apparently there's another house in that location that will be removed. So there's a couple of demolitions that will have to take place first. And this does consist of multiple tax lots where the project is, and we've indicated to the applicant that before he can do any development, he will have to go through a consolidation of those tracts so that he's not building over tax lot lines, and shouldn't be a problem, but that's most likely a replat of this area to implement that consolidation of the lots. The proximity of the trail to the east there, and then directly to the south, you can even see in this aerial there's a existing apartment complex. And we've got some public input from the owner of that, or manager of that apartment complex. And then we have high-density zoning then, of course, to the south, and we also have high-density zoning adjacent to the west as well. I believe those structures are only one story, though, so there is some difference in scale there. And there's high-density multifamily zoning across Territorial on the other side to the north. And so I think this next slide kind of gives you some indication then of the surrounding zoning actually here, with the darker being the R2 zoning. So I guess it's actually, I misspoke, it must be R1.5 in the zoning directly to the south. This is an indication of the site plan that's been proposed. As you can see, there's multiple buildings. I believe there's 7, counting the community center building on the site. And there's a mixture of 2- and 3-story buildings. One of the challenges the developer had was providing the required line of sight and buffering around the R1 zoning, which is that house that's remaining. And so there was quite a bit of work trying to make sure that they were providing the ordinance required setbacks there. The ordinance, of course, allows the 3-story buildings, and that's what predominantly you see on the site. There are some three-story buildings in the apartment complex that's directly to the south as well. He's achieving a density of over 22 units per acre, and I think there's some supplemental material that the applicant will probably get into later that actually I placed at your dais. And I think part of it was emailed to you last Friday. There's been some additional information and a correction to one of those pages that occurred today. And so the corrected copies are actually in front of you on the dais there. And hopefully the applicant will go through that. The 58 units are proposed, and right now it's indicating a mixture of 42, or maybe it was 48 two-bedrooms and 10 three-bedrooms. And that's the mix that there is right now. Probably the most important issue that came up with this application was providing an adequate amount of parking. And it was indicated from the very beginning that they were going to be slightly deficient, and therefore they applied for a variance application to address that and to provide an opportunity to argue for a variance of the parking standard and give you the authority with the actual application to make a potential exception or waiver dealing with the variance criteria and the argument that the applicant uses to explain his variance request. There was a traffic study that was done for this complex, and it had one primary recommendation, and that had to do with providing an adequate throat length in the driveway for cars coming in off of Territorial so they could adequately get off of Territorial before they were stopped by some car trying to back out and come out. And also to accommodate, because of the size of the proposal, the potential that there may be more than one car waiting to exit at the same time, and thus they would back up and block some of the parking spaces as they're trying to get out on the street, depending on the time of day and whether it's a busy time. Most of the time that is not likely to occur. But because of that, the traffic engineers and consultants that helped prepare the report said it's ideal to try to provide 40-foot or generally 2 car lengths when you're dealing with the amount of traffic that would be generated on site with this particular use. So it would be less if it wasn't as large of a project. And I had some supplemental question from the applicant about that requirement. Recently we approved actually the applicant's project on Highway 99 where he's building a commercial building for retail uses, and we asked for the same kind of thing that this study recommended, is that we give some space before you provide a parking space on site so that you're not blocking those and so cars can get off the highway. In that particular case, we recommended 35 feet, and that was adequate, and ODOT accepted that as a recommendation there to make sure the cars can get off the highway before they're stopped. The original traffic study recommended 40 feet in this location. We had some further discussion, and they said that there's no magic number as long as you understand what the desire is here, and they recommended that we go with 35 feet as being reasonable. And with 35 feet, that actually does result in the removal of the 2 in parking space, 1 on each side. And so I wanted you to keep that in mind, is the traffic study does recommend that we eliminate 2 parking spaces in this area. And then that comes into play because of the variance to reduce the parking. My understanding is, and we've got a lot of supplemental information here about the variance request and the parking, but I believe that 114.8 spaces, which has to be rounded up, so 115 spaces are required. And that includes a 10% reduction that would otherwise be required due to the an ordinance provision that allows a 10% reduction if you're over a certain density, which they're way over that amount, and so they took advantage of that 10% reduction. And that requires 108 parking spaces. I may get confused here now. I think that's what they were providing, and they're 7 spaces short, is what I'm remembering now. Let's see if I've got another. And I think that's the main issues that we reviewed in this. And if you, with the staff report, we did recommend approval of the site that was proposed, with the caveat that you needed to listen to the testimony and the arguments from the applicant dealing with the variance. And the variance was not just the number of parking spaces, but there was also a variance from the no more than 8 spaces in a row in a bank of parking spaces on site without an intervening landscape island. And so they're asking for a variance of that as well, and I'm going to let the applicant go ahead and get into that a little more detail, as they're going to give you some information related to that. So the staff didn't really provide you a definitive indication on the variance request. We're going to let the applicant make his argument. We did indicate in the staff report that we think there could be room to support a partial variance with the facts that we're aware of at this point right now. We did conclude that the site was large enough for what they're proposing. Certainly the use is allowed, and it seems to be a very functional layout. And they did take advantage of an emergency access for fire trucks that goes into the logging road trail. It will be blocked normally, but the fire department has agreed to that. They've done it in a couple other developments in town. And the logging road trail is built to a standard that can actually accommodate if they ever need to go down the road. And it was a preference in Public Works and the fire department, pretty much, in the fact that they had a potential another option paralleling the logging road out to Territorial, but it would be right adjacent to another driveway, right adjacent to the crossing of the trail across the road, and that did not seem to be a good idea to put another opening between those. And so I think everybody agreed that the emergency access on the existing trail, in the event that that should ever need to be utilized, would work just fine for this particular development. We did conclude that all the public utilities are adequate and can be made available to serve this site, and so that should not be a concern. I was going to mention just a couple of the recommendations dealing with the site plan aspect. The first I already mentioned is make your evaluation after listening to the applicant and testimony about the variance request. And then condition 2 is a common one that talks about meeting the recommendations that were in the city engineer's memorandum, and it's in our file. And we usually make sure those items are taken care of at the construction stage when we sign off on their construction plans, and we have the detailed engineering drawings before us at that time. The applicant provided some pretty good information on actual lighting fixtures, and it always becomes somewhat of an issue for staff, partly because lighting can get very complicated and technical. But basically, we have two things that we try to prevent is light trespass across the adjacent property boundary. There's a figure in our lighting ordinance that talks about that, but everyone just says we'll meet it, at trying to figure out whether they can actually, by the information they submit, do that is practically impossible for us. It's almost as if you got to make them aware of it and go out after it's built and call it a zoning violation if you can find out once the lights are on, if you can see the light bulb from the neighboring property. You're going to see light, but you're not supposed to be able to directly see the light bulb when you're standing on the neighbor's property. And so that's the idea of, it's kind of a dark sky thing where the lights are going mostly down. They can spread out some, but not across the property line. And then the other is just a standard for the amount of lumens that are allowed. And so without a picture, a cut sheet of the actual fixture that's being used, it's hard for us to tell if there's enough shielding to help make those things happen. And part of the information that was supplied to us was actually unreadable. And so we weren't able to see what kind of information might have been on part of what was, so we're just asking as a condition they submit some clear or additional information dealing with the lighting. Then the other items on number 4 had to do with the traffic study. There were a couple other minor recommendations, and one was to have a prohibition against parallel on-street parking for Territorial Road within a car length, basically on either side of the driveway on the same side. And that's all because of sight distance. It's easier when you're pulling out, looking both ways, not to have a car in the way as you're trying to pull out on that street. And so that's been a pretty common recommendation for site plans. We did that in the downtown area as well, which is almost more controversial because you expect at the slow speed in the downtown area to have cars parked parallel along the streets, but they can cause sight distance problems. And that really concludes my staff report. Take any questions.
One, is there a requirement for handicap parking stalls within this type of complex when they have a certain amount of handicap units listed?
Yes, and generally speaking, we direct the applicant, the building code and the state code, building code, and addresses that requirement. We actually don't have those provisions in our land development code, but we're aware that they have to comply with that. Most applicants are aware of that, and usually gets checked by we contract with the county to do our building, so they usually check that as well. I did not specifically review this application, so I can't address what they've done on that. I did not look at that aspect, but that's a good point to bring up.
Well, I'm just looking at, we've got a one-bedroom handicap unit, no adjacent handicap parking space, but if that's going to be a requirement, now we're going to lose another parking space on top of the ones that are already short.
That could be a relevant issue. So they certainly have to meet those requirements, and that's something that you can add just to be sure that they do as an additional condition of approval or something, and we can double check on that through the construction period. But that's important because they're wider. They may lose another space if they don't have the adequate number of spaces that the chart and the ADA requirements, federal standards. We just haven't pulled those down and dropped them into our code, partly because they seem to change and they're kind of complicated, and we didn't want to make our code thicker, so we just referred to them. Good point.
Other questions? I have a question. If we could refer back to the map That one. I know, leaving aside for a moment the emergency exit, there is no other exit from this complex. Is that correct?
They had, I don't know if this thing doesn't work.
Well,
I can't.
I can see
Along
only.
the logging road trail, the green area where they're actually proposing a park-like setting, even a bench that you would set off of the logging road trail in the strip between the house and the logging road trail up towards Territorial. There was thought at one point of that being the emergency access. That was the other choice that they had. There is no other choice.
Well, I think that my concern is, because I'd driven up and down Territorial 1,000+ times, plus I've walked that logging trail hundreds of times, and my concern is that in the event of emergency, they have a post right in the center of the entrance to the logging road trail. Now, if there is an emergency, the fire department or the police department can come along, they can remove that, but as my friends at the Clackamas County Sheriff's would say, when seconds count, the police and fire department are only minutes away. So my concern is if there is an emergency, people won't be able to get out of there. They simply, that's a lot of folks. And they won't be able to all cram into that exit or get out of that that one exit that's allowed there. I'm not quite sure how they're going to make sure that emergency exit is free and clear, other than in an emergency. I'm not quite sure how that's going to be configured. That's the first thing. The second thing is that traffic along Territorial in the mornings and in the evenings is very heavy because people get off of 99 to avoid going through downtown Canby. And so they get off of 99, get onto Territorial, go all the way down Territorial to Birch, and then go up Birch, which is a residential street, to Knightsbridge Road, and then down Knightsbridge Road to get onto I-5 or wherever the heck they're going. And they've done traffic studies that show that is upwards of 4,000 vehicles per day. So that's a lot of cars and trucks that are going down Territorial. So given that circumstance, you're going to be adding a lot of traffic, and so my concern is that there's no provision. It's just a simple 2-lane road. It goes 30 miles an hour, and so my concern is that there should probably be a left-hand turn lane going into the complex from Territorial, going from north to south. That would be one thing. So my concern is the emergency exit, traffic turning into the complex from northbound traffic or southbound traffic coming off of Territorial. We've got a couple of other concerns, but those are the two major ones that that I would see, and I think I think that definitely needs to be addressed. Both of those issues.
I might make just a quick comment. That is one of the reasons your territorial traffic question that we do traffic studies is to look at the traffic at the point that they join the city public street and to determine whether we need to study any nearby intersections due to the volume of traffic. And of course, in an absolute ideal situation, having a left turn lane in Territorial during those busy times would certainly help, during the real busy times, keep the turners, the left turners, from blocking the other people. But the study did not indicate that we're at the level and wouldn't be at the level with this development to justify the need for that kind of additional widening, construction. The level of service of the are not going to be impeded enough that it lowers anywhere to our adopted standards. And so, yeah, in an ideal world, so we don't impact anyone, would be nice, but that isn't what we usually do because we don't have the right-of-way to do it and those kind of things. I might mention that the applicant is dedicating 10 foot of additional right-of-way adjacent to this site, and they're building a sidewalk, of course, along Territorial Road. And addressing your other internal question, it sounds like a good point, is that the emergency access has always been focused on getting the emergency vehicle in and out, not necessarily on the tenants being to escape. And so, to my knowledge, the number of units being proposed on this site is meeting other ordinance provisions that we have that talk about if you get to a certain number, which I don't know what it is right now, I could look that up if you want to know, you have to have 2 means of exits and entrances just for the tenants themselves. I don't believe this one triggered that need, but it always triggers it for the emergency responders.
That trigger based upon the population of the complex, the number of units, what's that criteria?
I believe it's units. It's number of units is how I think it's done, and I can check that here later. I brought the code book.
Well, I have some concern about the amount of growth that's taking place up in the Redwood area, that 66 acres that's going to be developed over a course of time. The other properties that we have approved recently, I think we're building a time bomb here with the traffic situation that really needs to be addressed, or we're going to have some serious problems on Territorial.
I had a question. It appears that during the pre-application meeting, there was 48 units originally planned, and that was changed to 58 units to increase the density. I was just curious as to how the applicant was thinking they would address the parking issues with the increased density.
I'm not really sure what made his initial proposal to us, and at that time I think it probably was 48. But in the interim, as he studied the site, worked on the layout in more detail, and adjusted his 2- and 3-story, determined the mix of units, whether they were 2-bedroom or 3, and that made a difference in the parking, and whether he had 1, 2, or 3 bedrooms, and somewhere in all of that mix, in order to try to maximize the use of the site and still meet all ordinance requirements, except for the parking, which he's asked a variance of, he got up to the 58 units. So I really can't address that any differently. It's maximizing the site that's within the code, except for the parking standard.
Any further questions at this time? Okay, let's hear from the applicant. Please state your name and address. And
Tom Scott, applicant. Scott Beck, architect, 361 Northeast 3rd Avenue, Canby. Brian, do you want to
I think
put up my
getting it
PowerPoint?
up here.
Okay, so this is another aerial photo again of the site, maybe a little bit clearer than the one you saw previous. And as Brian had mentioned, let's see if this is working here. There's an existing structure here that would be demolished, as well as this building here. Currently, there is a driveway that comes along this area. This green patch here, I believe, is part of, it's probably part of it is the right-of-way for the logging trail. Part of it does fall on our site. To the south, again, there is multifamily residential. I believe it is the same zone, the R2. Again, R2 over here to the west, R2. And then this is the one section here of R1, single family. I think my light's going out. Next slide. Okay, so here we're back to our site plan. And again, we had proposed 58 living units. I guess to address the discussion about the pre-app, when we came, and looking at 48 units, that was very preliminary. Pre-apps are very efficient for having an opportunity to take a look at a project and then have a roundtable discussion, with various departments of the city, public works, utilities, et cetera. And so it's really, pre-apps are very much fact-finding, and it's not uncommon to reconsider a project, between the point of a pre-app and an application. So in this design, again, we're proposing 58 units, 48 two-bedroom and 10 three-bedroom buildings. And there are 7 buildings. Let's try this again. This first building is a 2-story structure, 3-bedroom units. These buildings on the perimeter are proposed as 3-story structures. This is a 3-story building here as well. And then this is a single-story recreation building and exercise building. Here in the center, there's an exterior recreation outdoor area, playground, picnic tables, kind of a plaza patio area, benches, and barbecues. Again, up in this corner, we're proposing kind of a pocket park that would be shared with the people using the Logging Road as a place to stop and rest and meet at the trailhead. And as far as landscaping, we did have a larger buffer here on both frontages abutting the R1 single-family zone. And we're also proposing a 6-foot privacy fence for screening. I believe it's just these 2 frontages along that property. We've also got some fairly strong pedestrian connections from Territorial through the site, a series of access curb ramps and crosswalks that then connect you ultimately over to the logging trail. Let's see here. As far as the access, I'd have to maybe defer to Pat Sissel, from Sissel Engineering, but I do believe that we were under the threshold that required 2 accesses for the development. There are requirements for fire truck access. When you come in off of public right-of-way over 150 feet, you're required to have a hammerhead turnaround or a cul-de-sac. You can't back trucks up. So the project does, over in this corner, provide a hammerhead turnaround for fire trucks, emergency vehicles to come in, turn around, and leave. It did make sense, though, to provide some provisions for a secondary way in if for some reason, let's say there was a fire or a problem here, that you did have a secondary way in. The difficulty with this strip here, again, is the fact that there's a lot of activity right here. There's a private driveway here. You have the access and the crosswalk here. There are also conditions on spacing of driveways, and I believe They have to be at least, is it 100 feet apart? And the difficulty with providing, for instance, let's say another access here, that would be too close to this one. So if we had an access here, these are closer than 100